In a small, quiet town nestled in the heart of the American South, life moved at its own unhurried pace. The streets were lined with oak trees, their branches stretching wide like protective arms over the community. On the surface, it seemed like an idyllic place to live. A town where everyone knew each other's names and neighbors exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences. But beneath this picturesque facade lay layers of tension, simmering quietly for years. At the center of much of this unrest was Frank Hargrove, a veteran deputy sheriff whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. Frank had been part of the local law enforcement team for nearly 3 decades. Over time, he became known not just for his dedication to the job but also for his controversial behavior. His actions often sparked heated debates among residents. Some praised him as a tough enforcer who kept troublemakers in line, while others accused him of harboring deep-seated prejudices that influenced how he treated people of color. Complaints against him piled up over the years, claims of racial profiling, unfair arrests, and harsh treatment during traffic stops, but nothing ever stuck. Whether through slick legal maneuvering or sheer stubbornness, Frank always managed to dodge accountability. Growing up under such a towering figure wasn't easy for Emily Hargrove, Frank's only daughter. From a young age, she idolized her father, seeing him as a hero who protected their town from danger. She loved hearing his stories about catching criminals and keeping the peace, even if some of those tales left her uneasy. As she grew older, though, cracks began to form in her admiration. Friends would whisper behind her back, calling her the deputy's kid, in ways that felt more mocking than respectful. Teachers sometimes eyed her warily, as if expecting her to follow in her father's contentious footsteps. Despite these challenges, Emily tried hard to carve out her own identity, separate from her father's shadow. Her chance came when she decided to join the police force herself. It wasn't entirely surprising. Law enforcement ran in her blood. But Emily believed she could do things differently. She saw herself as a bridge builder, someone who could mend the strained relationship between the department and the community. During her training, she worked tirelessly to prove her worth, determined to show that she wasn't just another version of her father. Her instructors noted her sharp instincts and strong work ethic, and for a while, it seemed like she might succeed in forging her own path. But reality proved harder than she'd imagined. Once on the job, Emily quickly discovered that being Frank Hargrove's daughter came with baggage she couldn't easily shake off. Residents were quick to judge her based on her last name, assuming she shared her father's attitudes whether she did or not. Worse still, certain habits crept into her behavior without her realizing it. Moments when she let bias cloud her judgment or failed to question orders that didn't sit right with her. These missteps earned her criticism from colleagues and civilians alike, leaving her feeling trapped between 2 worlds, one where she wanted to make a difference, and another where she was constantly compared to her father. One evening, Emily found herself attending a charity gala hosted by a local nonprofit organization. The event aimed to raise funds for scholarships benefiting underprivileged youth in the area. It was supposed to be a night of goodwill and camaraderie, bringing together influential figures from across the region. Among the attendees was James Calloway, a former FBI director turned civil rights advocate. Calloway had spent years speaking out against systemic racism within law enforcement, earning both admiration and animosity along the way. For many in the room, his presence symbolized hope for meaningful change. For others, including Emily, it stirred up conflicting emotions. Emily spotted Calloway across the crowded hall, standing near the bar with a group of admirers. Memories flooded back as she watched him laugh and shake hands with supporters. Years earlier, her father had faced scrutiny after Calloway publicly called out misconduct within the sheriff's department. Though no charges were filed, the investigation had tarnished Frank's reputation and fueled resentment toward Calloway and their household. Watching him now, Emily felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She told herself to ignore him, focus on enjoying the evening, and avoid any drama. But fate had other plans. As the night wore on, Emily mingled with guests, sipping wine and forcing polite smiles. Yet every glance toward Calloway reignited old frustrations. When she overheard someone praising his advocacy work, something inside her snapped. Without thinking, she approached him, her voice rising above the hum of conversation. "You think you're so righteous," she said, her words sharp and accusatory. "Do you have any idea what your campaigns have done to real people? People like my dad?" Calloway turned to face her, his expression calm but curious. "I'm sorry if my work has caused pain," he replied evenly. "But I assure you, my goal is to protect everyone, not hurt them." His composed demeanor only infuriated Emily further. She stepped closer, her anger bubbling over. Protect everyone? That's rich coming from someone who throws cops under the bus without knowing the full story. By now, a small crowd had gathered around them, sensing the escalating tension. Someone nearby muttered, "This isn't going to end well." What happened next unfolded in slow motion. In a moment of blind rage, Emily reached for her service weapon tucked securely in its holster. Before anyone could react, she pulled it out and pointed it directly at Calloway. The room fell deathly silent. Gasps echoed as guests froze in shock, unsure whether to flee or intervene. No shot was fired, but the mere act of drawing her gun sent waves of panic rippling through the crowd. Phones appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, capturing the scene on video. Within seconds, chaos erupted as security rushed forward to disarm Emily and escort her away. Back in the present, Emily sat alone in her car, replaying the events in her mind. How had it come to this? What had possessed her to pull her weapon in front of dozens of witnesses? Guilt and shame weighed heavily on her chest as she stared blankly at the dashboard. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, a grim reminder of the consequences awaiting her. Little did she know this single reckless act would set off a chain reaction that would forever alter her life and the lives of everyone around her. The aftermath of Emily's actions at the charity gala hit like a storm, sweeping through the small town with a force that left no one untouched. As videos of the incident spread across social media platforms, the once quiet community became the epicenter of national attention. The footage showed Emily standing face to face with James Calloway, her gun drawn and pointed directly at him. Her face was flushed with anger, her body tense as if she were on the verge of pulling the trigger. Though no shot was fired, the symbolism of the moment was unmistakable. A white police officer threatening a black civil rights advocate in front of dozens of witnesses. It was a scene that encapsulated decades of racial tension and mistrust between law enforcement and marginalized communities. Within hours, hashtags like Tachir Justice for Calloway and Dashachir Accountability Now began trending online. Comment sections erupted, with outrage, condemnation, and heated debates. Some viewers defended Emily, claiming that the situation had been blown out of proportion or that Calloway must have provoked her somehow. Others saw the incident as undeniable proof of systemic racism within policing, using it as evidence to demand sweeping reforms. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, sending reporters to the town to interview residents, officials, and anyone willing to speak on camera. Overnight, Emily Hargrove went from being a relatively unknown deputy to a household name, and not in a good way. Back in the town, reactions were just as polarized. At the local diner where farmers and factory workers gathered for their morning coffee, conversations buzzed with conflicting opinions. "She didn't mean any harm," one man argued, shaking his head. "You can see how upset she was. Anyone would have reacted the same way under pressure." Across the table, another chimed in. "But pointing a gun? That's not okay no matter what. She crossed a line, plain and simple." Similar discussions unfolded in grocery store aisles, church, pews, and school hallways. For a place that prided itself on its tight-knit nature, the divide seemed insurmountable. Meanwhile, Emily found herself thrust into an unfamiliar kind of isolation. Friends who had once laughed with her over lunch now avoided eye contact when they passed her on the street. Colleagues whispered behind closed doors, speculating about whether she'd lose her badge, or worse. Even family members tiptoed around her, unsure of what to say. Her father, Frank, tried to offer support, but his attempts only made things worse. "They're coming after you because of me," he muttered during one awkward dinner at home. "Don't let them win. Fight back." But Emily wasn't so sure anymore. Every time she replayed the events in her mind, she felt a growing sense of shame. What had she been thinking? Why hadn't she walked away instead of escalating the confrontation? As public pressure mounted, local authorities acted swiftly. Emily was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. Her service weapon was confiscated, and she was ordered to stay away from the station until further notice. The sheriff's department issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern over the incident while emphasizing the importance of due process. Still, many residents interpreted the response as too lenient, accusing the department of protecting one of its own. Protesters began gathering outside the sheriff's office, holding signs that read, "No more excuses" and "Hold them accountable." Their chants echoed through the streets, drawing both supporters and counter-protesters. James Calloway, on the other hand, remained remarkably composed throughout the chaos. In interviews, he spoke calmly and deliberately, refusing to vilify Emily personally. "This isn't about one individual," he explained. "It's about addressing the larger issues within our system. We need to focus on solutions rather than assigning blame." His measured tone earned him praise from allies and critics alike, though some accused him of being too forgiving. Privately, however, Calloway admitted that the incident had shaken him. He couldn't help but wonder how close he had come to tragedy. What if Emily had pulled the trigger? Would anyone have stopped her in time? Despite his outward calm, Calloway knew the stakes were high. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever felt unsafe or disrespected by law enforcement. If he stayed silent, the cycle of injustice would continue unchecked. So, he threw himself into advocacy work with renewed vigor, organizing rallies, writing op-eds, and meeting with community leaders to discuss tangible reforms. His efforts inspired others to join the cause, turning the tragedy into a catalyst for change. For Emily, the days dragged on endlessly. She spent most of her time holed up, in her apartment, avoiding the judgmental stares of neighbors and the relentless scrutiny of the media. Sleep eluded her, and when it did come, it was plagued by nightmares. She dreamed of standing in that crowded room again, her finger trembling on the trigger, unable to move or speak. When she woke, tears streaming down her face, she wondered if she'd ever escape the weight of her mistake. Her father's constant presence didn't help. Frank oscillated between anger and defensiveness, lashing out at anyone who dared criticize his daughter. He called old friends in powerful positions, urging them to intervene on Emily's behalf. When that failed, he took to social media, posting lengthy rants about cancel culture and political correctness gone mad. His antics only fueled the fire, drawing more negative attention to the family. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Emily snapped. "Stop making this about you," she shouted, her voice breaking. "You don't get it, Dad. This isn't just some smear campaign. It's my life we're talking about." Frank stared at her, stunned into silence. For the first time, he seemed to realize the depth of her despair. But rather than offering comfort, he retreated into sullen brooding, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts once again. Amidst the turmoil, there were moments of unexpected kindness. A former colleague reached out to check on her, reminding her that everyone makes mistakes. A neighbor left a basket of muffins on her doorstep with a note that simply read, "Hang in there." These small gestures gave Emily a glimmer of hope, even as the world around her seemed determined to crush her spirit. As the investigation progressed, details of the incident emerged piece by piece. Witnesses recounted the escalating argument, describing how Emily's demeanor shifted from frustration to outright hostility. Security footage confirmed that Calloway had remained calm throughout, raising questions about why Emily felt threatened enough to draw her weapon. Experts weighed in, analyzing everything from her training protocols to her mental state at the time. Each revelation added fuel to the fire, keeping the story alive in headlines and talk shows across the country. Through it all, Emily wrestled with a painful truth. She had become a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement. Whether fair or not, her actions reflected not just on herself, but on the entire system she had sworn to serve. And as much as she wanted to deny it, she couldn't ignore the role her upbringing had played in shaping her worldview. Growing up in Frank's shadow had taught her certain ways of thinking, ways that were now crumbling under the harsh light of accountability. One night, sitting alone on her couch, Emily picked up her phone and scrolled through the endless stream of comments and articles about her. Some were cruel, calling her names and wishing her failure. Others were sympathetic, urging her to seek help and learn from her mistakes. But one message stood out among the rest. It came from a stranger who identified themselves as a former police officer turned reform advocate. "I've been where you are," they wrote. "It's not easy facing your flaws, but it's worth it. Use this as a chance to grow." Emily stared at the words, letting them sink in. Maybe this wasn't the end of her story. Maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something new. The fallout from Emily's actions continued to ripple through the town, deepening divisions and forcing residents to confront uncomfortable truths about their community. What had started as a single impulsive act at a charity gala had spiraled into a full-blown reckoning, exposing fault lines that had long been ignored. The once close-knit town now felt fractured, with neighbors who had shared meals and holiday greetings now eyeing each other with suspicion and distrust. Protests became a near-daily occurrence outside the sheriff's office. Activists held signs, demanding accountability, chanting slogans like "No justice, no peace, and reform now." They argued that Emily's behavior was symptomatic of a larger problem, a system that allowed prejudice and misconduct to fester unchecked. Supporters of the Hargroves countered these claims, organizing counter-protests under banners reading, "Support our law enforcement," and "Due process matters." These opposing groups often stood mere feet apart, separated by barricades, but united in their passion. Tensions ran high, with shouting matches breaking out and tempers flaring. On more than one occasion, police had to step in to prevent physical altercations. Inside her apartment, Emily watched news coverage of the protests, feeling both anger and guilt. She saw herself portrayed as either a villain or a victim, depending on who was telling the story. Some defended her fiercely, claiming she'd been unfairly targeted because of her father's reputation. Others vilified her, painting her as the embodiment of everything wrong with law enforcement. Neither narrative felt entirely true or fair. She wanted to scream at the TV to explain that she wasn't the monster they made her out to be. But what could she say? Her actions spoke louder than any apology ever could. Her father, Frank, remained a polarizing figure in all of this. He refused to back down, doubling down on his stance that Emily was being persecuted unfairly. During interviews, he railed against what he called a witch hunt, insisting that his daughter was guilty only of standing up for herself. His fiery rhetoric drew mixed reactions. Some rallied behind him, praising his loyalty to his family. Others saw him as an obstacle to progress, blaming his past behavior for creating the toxic environment that led to this moment. Calls for his resignation grew louder, with critics arguing that his continued presence undermined public trust in the department. At home, Frank tried to shield Emily from the backlash, but his attempts often came across as controlling rather than supportive. He pushed her to fight back aggressively, suggesting strategies to discredit Calloway and shift the narrative in their favor. "We can spin this," he insisted during one heated conversation. "Make them see you're the real victim here." But Emily didn't want to play that game anymore. For the first time in her life, she questioned whether her father truly had her best interest at heart, or if he was more concerned with protecting his own legacy. As the investigation dragged on, Emily began attending mandatory counseling sessions as part of the terms of her administrative leave. At first, she resisted, viewing therapy as yet another punishment imposed on her. But over time, she found herself opening up to her counselor, sharing thoughts and feelings she hadn't dared voice to anyone else. Through these conversations, she started to unpack the biases she'd inherited from her upbringing. She realized how deeply ingrained those beliefs were, influencing her decisions in ways she hadn't even noticed before. It was painful work, forcing her to confront parts of herself she wasn't proud of. Yet it also gave her a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in years. One day, after a particularly intense session, her counselor encouraged her to reach out to James Calloway. "Apologies don't fix everything," the counselor said gently, "but they can be a starting point. If you're serious about changing, this might be your chance to take responsibility." The idea terrified Emily. How could she possibly face the man she had threatened with a loaded gun? What if he rejected her outright? Despite her fears, she decided to try. That evening, she sat down with pen and paper, pouring her heart into a letter. In the letter, Emily admitted her wrongdoing without excuses. She acknowledged the harm she had caused, not just to Calloway personally, but to the broader movement for justice and equality he represented. She expressed regret for letting her emotions get the better of her and vowed to learn from her mistakes. Most importantly, she asked for his forgiveness, knowing she didn't deserve it. When she finished writing, her hands trembled as she sealed the envelope. Sending it felt like stepping off a cliff, unsure of where she would land. To her surprise, Calloway responded within days. His reply was brief but thoughtful, thanking her for reaching out and agreeing to meet privately. "I believe in second chances," he wrote. "Let's talk." Those 4 words filled Emily with a mix, once again. The meeting between Emily Hargrove and James Calloway took place in a quiet corner of a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It was an unassuming location, chosen deliberately to avoid drawing attention. The last thing either of them wanted was for their conversation to become another spectacle for the media or the divided community. When Emily arrived, she felt her stomach twist with nerves. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say 100 times, but now that the moment was here, her words seemed to evaporate. James was already seated when she walked in. He stood up as she approached, offering a polite nod. "Emily," he said, his tone calm but firm, "thank you for coming." His demeanor wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. Neutral, like someone carefully weighing every word before speaking. Emily nodded back, clutching her bag tightly as if it might anchor her to reality. "Mr. Calloway," she began hesitantly, "thank you for agreeing to meet me." They sat down across from each other at a table tucked away by the window. For a few moments, neither spoke. The faint hum of background noise, the clinking of cups, the murmur of other patrons, filled the silence. Finally, James broke the ice. "I read your letter," he said. "It took courage to write something like that. Not everyone would have done it." His words caught Emily off guard. She had expected anger, skepticism, maybe even indifference, but this was unexpected. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," Emily replied quickly, her voice trembling slightly. "What I did was wrong, so wrong. And I'm not asking you to excuse it. I needed you to know how sorry I am. That night I wasn't thinking clearly. I let my emotions take over and I made a terrible mistake." Her hands fidgeted with the strap of her bag as she spoke, unable to meet his eyes directly. James leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. There was no trace of hostility in his expression, only a quiet intensity. "You're right. It was a terrible mistake," he said after a pause. "But mistakes aren't the end of the road. They're opportunities to learn, to grow. What matters is what you do next." He paused again, letting his words sink in. "Tell me, Emily, why did you decide to join law enforcement? Was it because of your father?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She hadn't anticipated such a direct line of inquiry, but somehow it didn't feel accusatory. Instead, it felt like an invitation. To be honest, not just with him but with herself. "At first, yeah," she admitted softly. "I grew up idolizing my dad. He always talked about protecting people, serving the community. I thought that's what being a cop meant. But once I got into the job, I realized it wasn't as simple as that. There were things about it, about him, that I didn't agree with. I wanted to make a difference, to prove I could be different, but..." Her voice trailed off and she sighed heavily. "I guess I failed at that too." James nodded slowly, listening intently. It's hard to break away from the expectations others put on us, he said, especially when those expectations come from someone we love. But owning up to our flaws is the first step toward real change. You've started that process by apologizing, not just to me, but to yourself. Now comes the harder part, figuring out how to move forward. Their conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from systemic racism within law enforcement to personal struggles with identity and purpose. James shared stories from his own life, recounting moments when he had faced injustice head-on and others when he had doubted his ability to keep fighting. He spoke openly about the pain of losing faith in institutions meant to protect and serve, but also about the hope he found in working alongside people committed to reform. For Emily, hearing him talk so candidly was both humbling and inspiring. She realized how much she still had to learn, not just about policing, but about humanity itself. By the time they parted ways, she felt lighter somehow, as though a weight she hadn't fully acknowledged was beginning to lift. Before leaving, James handed her a business card with a few names written on the back. These are people who've dedicated their lives to bridging the gap between law enforcement and marginalized communities, he explained. If you're serious about making a change, reach out to them, learn from their experiences, and remember, you're not alone in this. Back in the town, tensions remained high, but there were signs of progress. The protests outside the sheriff's office had evolved into organized town hall meetings, where residents could voice their concerns and propose solutions. Activists worked alongside local leaders to draft policy changes aimed at increasing transparency and accountability within the department. While disagreements persisted, the conversations were more constructive than confrontational, a small but significant shift. Meanwhile, Frank Hargrove found himself increasingly isolated. Public pressure mounted for his resignation, and even some of his closest allies began distancing themselves. One evening, after yet another heated argument with Emily, he finally relented. In a brief statement issued through the department, he announced his decision to step down, citing health reasons and a desire to spend more time with his family. Though many celebrated the news as a victory for accountability, others quietly mourned the loss of a man who, despite his flaws, had devoted decades of his life to the town. With her father out of the picture, Emily felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Their relationship had always been complicated, but she couldn't deny the role he had played in shaping her worldview. Now, without his influence looming over her, she had the freedom to redefine herself, to figure out who she truly wanted to be. Her journey toward redemption wasn't easy. After weeks of deliberation, the Internal Affairs Board reached its verdict. Emily would be fired from the police force for gross misconduct. The ruling devastated her, but she accepted it without protest. Losing her badge was painful, but she understood why it had to happen. More importantly, she knew it wasn't the end of her story. Determined to turn her life around, Emily enrolled in courses focused on sociology and criminal justice reform. She immersed herself in learning about systemic issues within policing, seeking to understand the root causes of the problems she had once ignored. Through volunteer work with advocacy organizations, she connected with activists, educators, and former officers who shared her vision for a better future. Slowly but surely, she began rebuilding her reputation, not as a defender of the status quo, but as an advocate for meaningful change. One day, while attending a workshop on implicit bias training for law enforcement, Emily met a young officer named Marcus. Like her, he had grown disillusioned with certain aspects of the job but refused to give up entirely. They bonded over their shared struggles, exchanging ideas and encouragement. "It's tough out there," Marcus admitted during one conversation. "Sometimes it feels like we're swimming against the tide, but if we can inspire even one person to think differently, isn't that worth it?" Emily smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she could make a positive impact, not as a cop, but as someone determined to heal the wounds caused by years of mistrust and division. By the time autumn rolled around, Emily had made significant strides in her personal growth. She started speaking at conferences and workshops, sharing her story as a cautionary tale and urging fellow officers to examine their biases. Her honesty resonated with audiences, sparking important discussions about accountability and reform. Critics still questioned her motives, but supporters praised her willingness to face uncomfortable truths and commit to change. In the town, life began to return to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. The protests faded, replaced by collaborative efforts to address long-standing inequalities. Residents who had once been divided found common ground in their desire for a safer, fairer community. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As Emily stood on the sidelines of a Unity March one crisp October morning, watching diverse groups of people walk side by side, she felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the scars wouldn't disappear overnight, but healing was possible if people were willing to listen, learn, and act. For the first time in a long time, Emily believed she was exactly where she was meant to be, stepping out of her father's shadow and forging a path toward a brighter future. Months had passed since the night that changed everything for Emily Hargrove. The town, once torn apart by anger and division, was slowly stitching itself back together. Change didn't come easily. It never did. But there were signs of progress everywhere you looked. New policies were implemented within the sheriff's department to increase transparency and accountability. Officers underwent mandatory training on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Community leaders partnered with law enforcement to host open dialogues, creating spaces where grievances could be aired and solutions brainstormed collaboratively. For Emily, this period marked a turning point in her journey. She no longer wore a badge or carried a gun, but she discovered a new kind of purpose, one rooted in education, advocacy, and bridge building. Her days were filled with workshops, seminars, and volunteer work aimed at fostering understanding between police forces and marginalized communities. At first, stepping into these roles felt daunting. The weight of her past mistakes loomed large, and she often questioned whether anyone would take her seriously. But as time went on, she realized that redemption wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about using those experiences to create something meaningful. One of the most transformative moments came when she was invited to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. Standing behind the podium, looking out at an audience of hundreds, she felt a surge of nerves. What could she possibly say that hadn't been said before? Then she remembered James Calloway's words. Mistakes aren't the end of the road. They're opportunities to learn, to grow. Taking a deep breath, she began to share her story. Not just the parts she was proud of, but the painful ones too. I used to think being a good cop meant following orders without question, she told the crowd. I thought it meant protecting my own at all costs. But I learned the hard way that true justice isn't blind loyalty or unwavering authority. It's about fairness. It's about listening. And sometimes, it's about admitting when you're wrong, even if doing so feels like tearing yourself apart. Her speech earned a standing ovation, not because it was perfect, but because it was raw and honest. People approached her afterward, thanking her for her vulnerability and asking how they could apply her lessons to their own lives. For Emily, these interactions became a source of strength. They reminded her that while forgiveness couldn't undo the past, it could pave the way for a better future. Back home, Emily continued working closely with local organizations focused on reform. One project in particular held special meaning for her. A mentorship program designed to connect young people from underserved neighborhoods with officers willing to listen and learn. Through this initiative, she met teenagers who had grown up distrusting law enforcement, kids whose parents had warned them to avoid interactions with police at all costs. Hearing their stories broke her heart, but it also fueled her determination to make a difference. One afternoon, while leading a discussion with a group of high school students, Emily found herself sitting across from a quiet girl named Maya. Maya rarely spoke during meetings, preferring to observe rather than participate. But when Emily asked the group why they thought building trust between communities and police mattered, Maya surprised everyone by raising her hand. Because we're tired of feeling scared, she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. We want to believe things can change, but it's hard when every story we hear makes us feel like nothing ever will. Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. You're right, she replied. Change is hard, and it doesn't happen overnight. But it starts with conversations, like this, with people willing to sit down, listen, and try to understand each other. That's how we move forward. Maya smiled faintly, and for the first time, Emily saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. Moments like these kept her going. Even, on days when doubt crept in, she knew she couldn't fix everything, that some wounds ran too deep for one person to heal, but she believed every small step counted. As winter approached, the town prepared for its annual holiday festival, a beloved tradition that brought residents together for music, food, and celebration. This year, however, organizers decided to dedicate part of the event to unity and reconciliation. Booths were set up where attendees could write messages of hope and solidarity on colorful ribbons, which were then tied to trees lining the main square. Emily volunteered to help run one of the booths, eager to contribute to the spirit of togetherness. On the day of the festival, the air buzzed with energy. Families strolled through the streets, children laughed as they chased each other around, and the smell of hot cocoa wafted through the crisp air. At Emily's booth, people of all ages stopped to leave their thoughts. Some wrote simple phrases like, "Peace begins with us," or "Together we rise." Others penned longer reflections, sharing personal stories of struggle and resilience. As Emily read each ribbon, she felt a profound sense of connection to the community, to the cause, and to the possibility of a brighter tomorrow. Later that evening, as fireworks lit up the sky, Emily stood near the center of the square, watching the glowing ribbons sway gently in the breeze. Beside her stood Marcus, the young officer she had befriended months earlier. He nudged her playfully. "Not bad for a former deputy, huh?" he teased, grinning. Emily chuckled, shaking her head. "I'm still figuring it out," she admitted, "but I think I'm finally starting to get it." Marcus nodded, his expression turning thoughtful. "You know, you've done more good in the last few months than most people do in a lifetime. Don't forget that." His words stayed with her long after the festival ended. Driving home that night, Emily reflected on how far she'd come and how much farther she still had to go. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And though the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay in store. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through her bedroom window, Emily opened her laptop to draft an email. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, carefully outlining her ideas and gathering resources. Now, with a mix of excitement and apprehension, she hit send. The message was addressed to several local schools and community centers, proposing a series of workshops aimed at teaching teens conflict resolution and empathy skills. If successful, the program could serve as a model for similar initiatives nationwide. Within hours, responses began pouring in. Principals expressed interest in hosting sessions. Parents thanked her for taking action. Even some former critics reached out, acknowledging the positive impact she was making. Reading through the replies, Emily felt a swell of gratitude for the second chances life had given her, for the people who had supported her along the way, and for the opportunity to keep growing. By spring, the workshop series was up and running, drawing participants from across the region. Each session reinforced Emily's belief in the power of dialogue and mutual respect. Watching students engage in heartfelt discussions about race, privilege, and accountability filled her with pride, not just in them, but in herself. She had started this journey burdened by guilt and shame, unsure if she deserved forgiveness. Now she realized that redemption wasn't about earning back trust. It was about earning the right to help others build a better world. One sunny afternoon, as Emily wrapped up a particularly lively workshop, a familiar figure appeared at the doorway. It was James Calloway. Smiling warmly, he walked over and extended his hand. "Looks like you're doing exactly what you promised," he said, his tone approving. making a difference. Emily shook his hand, feeling a rush of emotion. I couldn't have done it without your guidance, she replied sincerely. Thank you, for everything. James nodded, his gaze softening. You've come a long way, Emily, keep going. As he turned to leave, Emily watched him walk away, a sense of peace settling over her. She knew the scars of the past would always remain, reminders of the lessons she had learned. But she also knew that healing was possible, if people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and commit to change. That evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Emily allowed herself to dream of what the future might hold. She envisioned a world where trust replaced fear, where compassion triumphed over prejudice, and where everyone, regardless of background or circumstance, felt safe and valued. It was a lofty vision, perhaps, but one worth striving for. And so, with renewed determination, Emily stepped fully into her new role, not as the daughter of a controversial sheriff's deputy, nor as a disgraced former officer, but as someone committed to leaving the world better than she found it. In doing so, she proved that even the hardest journeys can lead to redemption, and that sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with a single, courageous choice.